Hi, everyone. I hope you're well. Welcome to the Realpolitik podcast. Today, we'll be speaking about the military coup and subsequent junta in Myanmar, focusing on regional powers, the ASEAN, and global powers, including China and the United States. And we'll also be giving policy prescriptions and recommendations to Canada, the US, and beyond. And to do that, I am honored to be hosting three very distinguished guests. First, we'll be speaking to Dr. Yongwook Ryu, who teaches at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore. His research and teaching focuses on the ASEAN and East Asian politics. We spoke on the current state of affairs in Myanmar and the role played by regional powers. Then I spoke to Senior Southeast Asia Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, Josh Kurlantzick. And finally, I discussed with journalist Sebastian Strangio, who is the Southeast Asia editor at the Diplomat. First, here's my conversation with Professor Ryu. Thank you for listening. You maybe elaborate a little bit on what happened in February and what's happened since then in Myanmar?
Right. So just very briefly, right? So on the 1st of February this year, there was a military coup initiated by the military, right, known as Tatmadaw in Myanmar, and their rationale for the military coup is that the election that was held in November last year had been rigged, and therefore they were calling for a new election, right? Of course, the most of ordinary Myanmar people could not accept it. So they didn't agree with the military, and the way they perceived the military coup is this sort of lame excuse for the military to take back political power. And I think that's actually a fairly accurate assessment of the motives behind the military. And then there were large, right, scale pro-democracy protests throughout Myanmar, which were violently crushed by the military. And so initially, the demand that these pro-democracy supporters made towards the military is respect their votes, right? But the nature of these protests since then has evolved to some extent to the issue of establishing a federal union of Myanmar. So by bringing different ethnic groups, right, in Myanmar and establishing a long-lasting, genuine system whereby, right, the dominant Burma, right, ethnic group could coexist with other various ethnic groups. So certainly the democracy is an important aspect to the protest movement, but there is this added element of establishing a federal union of Myanmar. And of course, the military does not accept this. And then ASEAN, right, decide to get involved in the issue. There have been some official meetings held among the other ASEAN member states. Some points have been agreed, but not much action has been taken by ASEAN at the moment. I know that there are certain things going on behind the door, but we are yet to see concrete action taken by ASEAN towards the military.
There's quite a lot you brought in there. I'll start by asking, so the military, the leaders, they often mention, okay, we are taking power temporarily, and we will hold an election with multi-party system and respect the results of the election. Do you think that that's going to happen, or do you think it's a sham?
I mean, it's hard to know. I think most people think that the military's promise is in some sense genuine, right? So they do want to hold a fair and free election. But who's going to monitor the election, right? That's the key question. And there, I don't think the military will invite international observers or regional observers, right, for the free and so-called free and fair election that they want to hold. And therefore, whatever outcome that comes out, right, we will have fairly low level of trustworthiness. And I don't think the ordinary people in Myanmar will accept an outcome that is different from the one that we received in November, right, 2020 election. So, I mean, I think the military wants to hold a free and fair election, but I think there is a big question mark as to how free and fair it's going to be.
That's right. I think part of the issue is they will hold the election, but at the same time, they won't let outsiders and even insiders monitor it. So they've shut down internet, they've shut down protests. they've shut down attempts by human rights groups, journalists to enter the country and talk to certain people. I've seen even CNN, they went in and they were one of the only ones to go in. And when they did interview people, the ones they did interview went to jail afterwards, a lot of them. So it seems like if there were a free and fair election, it'd be done by their standards and not by international or outside standards.
Right. And also, a lot of the leaders of the pro-democracy movement, either they are already in exile or they are fleeing the military. So they cannot really, run for office, right, in the next election. So, given that the leadership of the opposition, the pro-democracy camp, cannot run for office, right? That's already going to bias the outcome in favor of the military.
And you mentioned the ASEAN. So for people who might not know, could you explain what they are, what they do, and why they're relevant to the crisis and the coup?
All right. So ASEAN stands for Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and it was established in 1967 with original 5 maritime countries of Southeast Asia that shared, an anti-communist stance, right, in their foreign policy orientation. So these original 5 countries are Indonesia, Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, and the Philippines. And then the membership expanded to include Brunei in 1984. And then throughout the 1990s, right, ASEAN managed to bring all 4 Indo-Chinese countries, right, so Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and Vietnam, under this regional framework. So currently ASEAN has 10 member states, and it's the premier regional organization in Southeast Asia. And it's been very influential in shaping Asian institutional landscape. So, all the major regional institutions in Asia have either been established by ASEAN or grew out of ASEAN. So, the ARF, the ASEAN Regional Forum, which brings all countries in the Asia Pacific to discuss security issues, was established by ASEAN, and later it grew out of ASEAN. And then there's also ASEAN +3 framework. So the +3 countries are Japan, South Korea, China. So they are linked with ASEAN through this +3 framework. Mm-hmm. There's also ASEAN +6 framework. So that's basically ASEAN +3 plus additional 3 countries. So these additional 3 countries are New Zealand, Australia, and India. So basically ASEAN brought all the regional countries, right, in Asia. And then there's also East Asia Summit, which brings US and Russia, right, and some other countries. So so that's the importance of ASEAN. That's why it regards itself as a central actor in regional affairs. And this notion is known as ASEAN centrality. The organization operates on the principles and norms of Westphalian, right, system. So that's non-intervention, sort of state sovereignty, consensual decision-making, and lots of consultation. And what this means is that it does not seek to intervene in internal affairs of member states in an explicit manner. Instead, through sort of quiet and soft diplomacy, it seeks to shape and influence the perceptions and views of its member states and hopefully nudge them in a particular decision path. This is exactly what ASEAN seeks to do, right, with regard to the current crisis in Myanmar. And as you can see, right, any organization that has 10 members, it's not as big as United Nations, but still 10 members of varying degrees of economic and social development, different political regimes, right, and so on and so forth. It's going to be very difficult to achieve any kind of consensus if you need to make collective decision based on consensus, right? So, oftentimes people get frustrated by how slow and ineffective ASEAN can be. And I think that sort of criticism is legitimate and validated. But ASEAN really is the only actor that can actually play some role and has some leverage over the military at the moment. And perhaps that's why the US, UN, China, right, Japan, and all the major international players have given the task of managing the political crisis in Myanmar to ASEAN. So you see that, right, in various official statements being mentioned.
Right. And there are players that disagree with the Indonesian or more Pacific region position of criticizing the military coup and what its actions are doing and asking for specific concessions. Examples would be China and Vietnam, who are usually seemingly more supportive of the military and what they're doing as opposed to the pro-democracy movements and parties. And how does that impact votes and ASEAN business?
Yeah, I do think that there are actually three different views, right, within ASEAN,
Hmm.
and also, outside of ASEAN. So the first view is sort of a hardline, principled approach based on values that ASEAN needs to strive for, and that position is mainly taken up by Indonesia, right, and some other members. So they become very critical of the military in Myanmar, right? So that's one view. The second view is more practical view. And you get to hear this voice, especially in Singapore. So, they're not friends of the military in Myanmar, or they don't approve the atrocities committed by the military, but they do think that the military is a key part of the current Myanmar's political structure, and therefore it has to be part of whatever political negotiation that has to take place. So this is a more pragmatic and practical view.
Mhm.
And then the third view is taken by some authoritarian regimes or countries that have had recent military coups of their own. So that's countries like Vietnam and Thailand, and outside of Southeast Asia, countries like China and Russia. So they are not concerned too much about the military coup in Myanmar. They think it's a domestic issue, therefore it's none of others' business to get involved, and they also have their own material interests in Myanmar, which are aligned with the survival of the military. Either being quiet or maybe behind the scene, they are providing certain support, degree of support to the military.
And the smaller powers like Brunei and Singapore, and you could even say Taiwan, Hong Kong, which those might be complicated to get into. But so Brunei and Singapore, for example, where do they stand on Myanmar and the coup, and what impact do they have in all this? Are they kind of stuck in the middle between those bigger regional powers, or do they kind of just stay back and let them do
Right.
that?
So usually Brunei, is too small to have much impact, on the collective decision of ASEAN. But this year, Brunei is the chair country of ASEAN. So it has to be the one issuing out all the official ASEAN statements. And it's being pushed by Indonesia to be more active. So there's been a flurry of diplomatic activities, taking place among Indonesia, Brunei, Singapore, Malaysia, and to some extent, the Philippines. So that's the role of Brunei, so far this year. I mean, there are various views, within Singapore. I think the Singaporean government has been quite vocal and critical of the military, much to many people's surprise. So you would regard Singapore to be closer to Indonesia, on the current political crisis. Within the policy circles in Singapore, as I said, there are various views, So there's a practical view that says, well, whether you dislike the military or not, we have to get military involved in order to establish sort of lasting and meaningful political reconciliation. There are some others like me who would argue that we need to take more hardline stance towards the military, because it's not the first time, we've had a Rohingya crisis, and that in itself is a major atrocity. The UN describes the Rohingya crisis as a clear case of ethnic cleansing, and that's a crime against humanity. And ASEAN didn't take any position on that issue, on that matter. And a few years later, we have this political crisis, military coup in Myanmar. And if ASEAN doesn't take a strong stance and position on the military, after these two major incidents, then I think the organization loses its sense of purpose. But we have different views within Singapore. We do have a humanitarian crisis taking place in Myanmar, at the moment. So, because of the civil disobedience movement, doctors stopped treating patients, right? Teachers stopped teaching kids. Public servants, a lot of them have stopped, right, performing their public duties. And we still have a COVID, right, 19, right, in the world, in Asia. So the patients are not being treated, the kids are not being educated, right, and so on and so forth. So that creates a major humanitarian crisis, which ASEAN is well aware of, and it wants to provide aid to Myanmar and local groups. And ASEAN does have a framework, a certain mechanism to do this. Beyond these official mechanisms, I know that there are certain NGOs that just go through unofficial channels to provide assistance, right? So especially from Thailand, right? So there's a long border between Thailand and Myanmar, and they can just cross over the border and then provide aid and finances and supplies to local ethnic groups there. But obviously, right, such mechanism, unofficial mechanism, oftentimes can be quite ineffective, and obviously it's not going to be a major solution to the general humanitarian crisis taking place in Myanmar.
I'm simply curious, why Thailand? I know Myanmar has borders with, is it 5 countries? So there's India, there's Bangladesh, there's Thailand, there's Malaysia, and there's China. Why are most NGOs and aid going through Thailand?
Right. So India has, as we all know, India has its own major COVID problem to deal with. So it's not concerned at all. Bangladesh doesn't have much means, right? And Malaysia is not as free. China, right, is not concerned about, right, others' businesses too much. Whereas Thailand has been, right, more free. Civil society has been quite active in Thailand, even under the military dictatorship. Civil society has, quite been active. So therefore, foreign NGOs feel comfortable to operate, right, in Thailand. So, and once you set up this kind of, right, organizations, right, there's a path dependency, right? So others will flow in. It becomes easier for you to operate, right, in the future. So there's that historical connection between Thailand and Myanmar. So the northern part of Thailand and then the southern part of Myanmar, right, sharing long borders. And then there's been a lot of NGO activities taking place along that border.
What do you think ASEAN should do to respond to this crisis?
Yes. Okay. So I guess that's a policy relevant question, right? I think honestly, my sense is that we've lost too much time, right, to date, and ASEAN has been really, really slow, and I think the reason is that they didn't see or feel the necessity to be urgent, right, on this matter, and as a result, as I said, right, the nature of this domestic conflict in Myanmar has evolved from, right, sort of inter-Burmese ethnic conflict about political power to, right, establishing federal union of Myanmar, and the perceptual gulf between the military and the West in Myanmar has only widened. So nowadays they treat each other as terrorists, and they don't regard the other as a legitimate, right, group to negotiate with. So obviously, when these domestic groups take such a hard line stance, no matter, right, how much effort international or regional actors try to make, it's going to be really difficult to bring them together. So that's really unfortunate, right? We've lost too much time. And even today, I don't actually sense the kind of urgency that is needed, right, to deal with the Myanmar crisis on the part of ASEAN. So that's really disappointing to me. I think going forward, what ASEAN can do and should do is certainly to exert greater diplomatic pressure on the military. And one thing that's going for ASEAN, which generates the leverage of ASEAN over the military, is that the military really needs ASEAN in order to increase its international recognition, right? So, a lot of people think that the military and China have a close relationship, but that's actually not quite accurate. The military does not want to rely on China. It has a deep sense of mistrust of Beijing. Of course, if it runs out of options, then it will go with Beijing, but it does not, it seeks to avoid, right, relying on Beijing. Therefore, the only actor that the military in Myanmar feels comfortable in terms of interacting and sharing views is ASEAN. And hence, if ASEAN exerts diplomatic pressure on the military, then it could have some success. And this is why I personally advocate that ASEAN should consider temporary suspension of Myanmar's membership of ASEAN until such time that Myanmar corrects its own actions, right, towards the democracy movement or groups, and establish a clear timeline for a free and fair election. In terms of what other international actors can do, as I said right earlier in our interaction, all the major players have given ASEAN the task of managing the Myanmar crisis, which to me is a reflection that they are not really They're not really concerned about what's happening in Myanmar, rather than they are respecting ASEAN. What they can do is, I think one thing that they can do, which will strengthen the pro-democracy groups in Myanmar, is to recognize and approve CRPH and the National Unity Government of Myanmar. So these two groups are widely perceived as representing the pro-democracy groups, as well as important ethnic minorities in Myanmar. And these groups want to get recognition and approval from regional and international actors. ASEAN has not given them any recognition. If the Western countries recognize these domestic pro-democracy groups in Myanmar as being legitimate, that's certainly going to strengthen their political power in Myanmar. So that's something that they can do. There has been a call for R2P, the responsibility to protect. But that's a highly unlikely. Nothing will go through the UN Security Council, and I don't think any other individual powers think about taking a unilateral humanitarian intervention in Myanmar. I think in the end, this is a basically domestic issue that need to be settled between the military and the various groups in Myanmar. And there, I'm quite pessimistic. The perceptual distance between the military and the rest of Myanmar has traveled in such a different path over the last several months that they don't really want to sit down and negotiate. And there's a real chance that the current crisis could degenerate into some sort of civil war, which could be prolonged for a long period of time, with the involvement of external powers such as China and the USA. And if you pay attention to the general dynamics of international relations at the moment, we are gradually moving into a new kind of Cold War between US and China. And during the old Cold War, the great power rivalry and conflict took place in Asia, on the Korean Peninsula, and in Vietnam, right? And maybe in this new emerging Cold War between US and China, who knows, maybe Myanmar will become a pawn of great power politics and conflict. Then the current crisis, this political crisis that began as a domestic power struggle, could evolve to become this genuine international proxy war between US and China. And that's an outcome that will not serve anybody. US, China, Myanmar, ASEAN. So that's a situation that must be avoided. And in order to avoid that kind of outcome, then ASEAN has to take an urgent action, but we don't see much action coming from ASEAN. We've not seen any explicit and major involvement of great powers in the political crisis in Myanmar. As I said, they've been happy to let ASEAN manage the situation, but there's no guarantee that the great powers will sit quietly in the future. And as I said earlier, I think cynical interpretation of this notion of ASEAN centrality in shaping and managing regional affairs, where great powers can intervene whenever they want. So on issues that do not concern them, they will just let ASEAN play whatever role it wants to play. And a good example of this is South China Sea. So South China Sea is obviously in Southeast Asia. Therefore, it's something that ASEAN should be in charge of managing it. But for the past few years, right, the U.S. have dispatched its aircraft carriers. The European powers have dispatched their submarines and aircraft carriers, and China also operates its own aircraft carriers in South China Sea. And where's ASEAN centrality? Right? Nowhere. And we might see something like that happening, or that sort of dynamic unfolding in Myanmar in the future if great powers decide to get involved. And if one gets involved, the other will automatically get involved, because Myanmar is such a critical and geopolitically strategic location for China and the USA, sitting between India and China, and India obviously is part of the Quad. So that's important. Myanmar provides access to Beijing to go out to the Indian Ocean without going through the Malacca Strait and the South China Sea. So given that, if one gets involved, the other will automatically get involved. And obviously, the current political crisis in Myanmar will become an international conflict. And the conflict could be prolonged, beyond what we initially expected, when the military coup took place. But I think, my pessimism only grows each day that passes by.
Many thanks to Dr. Ryu for his insight and his participation. Then I spoke with Josh Kurlantzick, a Southeast Asia Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations in Washington, D.C. We discussed the history of military rule in Myanmar, followed by security dynamics on the ground and the psychology of the military junta. That's right. And would you see this coup as a continuation of 1962 era politics and the dictatorship that came basically between 1962 and up to democratic rule?
Between 1962 and the early 90s, it was technically sort of a socialist junta, although it's hard to explain what that really means. It was more essentially an isolated and sort of socialist junta, and then it became a sort of capitalist junta, and it's a sort of an ideology-free junta at this point in terms of those sort of the broader ideologies. The ideology is one of sort of paranoid nationalism combined with a desire to maintain the military's political power as well as its whole range of economic interests. So there are lines back in 1962, but I mean, I think the junta that ruled after the late 80s and early 90s, which was the period when Suu Kyi first came to prominence, and there was 3 elections in 1990 that Suu Kyi's party won that were then essentially disallowed. That junta, run by Aung San Suu Kyi, paved the way towards some sort of modest reform in the early 2010s. And it seemed like to some extent there could have been some sort of situation in which the military that sort of inherited power from San Suu Kyi, who had retired, would coexist with Suu Kyi and NLD. But as it became more and more clear that that wasn't really going to happen, Suu Kyi's party won massively in the 2020 elections, and there was a real threat to the military's power in a lot of ways. I think the military leaders just dumped that sort of coexistence plan. So there's differences between now and 1962. I mean, in terms of the way the military sort of its priorities. I mean, but some of them are the same, others are different in terms of its economic interest today. But, and there's certainly differences in terms of the way their ability to pull off such a coup. It was a lot easier in 1962.
That's right. And you had mentioned repression on the ground, so the crackdown that's still ongoing. Would you say it's unilateral in that it's simply the government, the military cracking down on protesters, or is it clashes, so to speak? Like, is there a response from the civilians at all?
The military hoped that they were going to be able to have a coup that would then just essentially be accepted by the international community and by South Asian states. And there are states that are being accepted, China, Russia, and some of the South Asian states are going to fall in line, but that the Myanmar people would accept it and that didn't, and they would sort of put forward some sort of theoretical plan towards elections that would allow the military to create a situation in which their favored parties would win elections and the NLD would be sidelined. And then it didn't happen. There was massive protests, first not protests, and the military just sort of returned to what we knew, which was just like that brutal and direct force, which is being applied all over the country. No, I mean, I think at this point, some of the protesters have now clearly turned to violent reprisals, and you have state collapse in parts of the country and increasing possibility of a kind of just sort of chaos.
Has that been effective?
Chaos.
Has that been effective, the response, or not at all?
I mean, I think the response has been effective at denying the military what it wanted, which was to have a coup that was accepted broadly and widely and to quash the population. I don't think that this level of this sort of like low-lying, low-intensity conflict across the country is likely to dislodge the military, which is a massive organization and fairly well unified and heavily supplied with heavy weapons. So I don't think they're going to be successful in doing that, but it has had some success in sort of creating chaos, and also they've had some diplomatic success, in sort of creating a narrative of a potential alternative government.
And the sort of pushback against this coup and the junta, is it organized? Is it unified? Are there parties? Are there organizations? Or is it completely in disarray?
There's a general civil disobedience movement, and there is a sort of opposition exile government that has been put together, and notably, unlike in the past in Myanmar, there seems to be a greater acceptance of the idea that Myanmar is a diverse country, and some future government that was elected or any kind of future government needs to recognize that diversity and not just simply be Burman or Burma dominated, and possibly also even recognize Myanmar as a more federal country with a more federal governmental setup. So the exile government has some degree of organization, but in terms of the protests, particularly the sort of, urban chaos, I'm not sure the level of organization. I mean, there is some cooperation, seems like, between some of the urban protesters or violent actors and the ethnic armed organizations that exist sort of in the periphery of central Myanmar, the level of which I think is hard to know.
And just to sort of linger on the actual societal breakdown that's happening, that trend doesn't seem to be shifting, right? It seems like it just completely in complete disarray, and that's not going away. People are still, bureaucrats are still leaving their job or going on strike. Social services are still not.
The longer that it goes on and the more violence you have and the more urban violence, the more likely that state collapse will perpetuate it. And the military doesn't have the resources within the military to replace all of those civil servants. And I'm not sure where they would possibly get them from.
And so why is if there's nothing to materially gain from this coup and this junta, why are the military still
there's a lot materially to gain. They gained power. I don't think they expected this level of resistance, but they still gained power, and they have control of a wide range of industries, and now they have control of more industries. They may be willing to allow the country to simply burn in order to maintain control. Those two things may go together. Again, the situation is not exactly parallel to Syria, where you had the influence in the conflict in Syria of many foreign actors, regional foreign actors who were actively involved in supporting armed groups there or Assad. That's not going to happen here. I mean, China and Russia have some degree of support for the Burmese government, but the concept that was expressed in the conflict in Syria, and it's the title of an excellent book about Syria, Assad will burn the country, essentially, that I think applied, some of that thinking is being applied here by the Myanmar military, and just burn the country, willing to burn the country in order to maintain control. And also, even with the economy in tatters and the state in collapse, the military still has sources of revenue that are essentially untouchable. untouchable by outsiders and that they can continue to rely on. They still have oil and gas revenue. They have revenue that can be raised from other extractive industries. There's revenue that can be raised from illegal industries like the methamphetamine industry and others. So they apparently see this still as preferable to some sort of negotiated solution.
And you mentioned Russia and China giving them support. Is it tacit support or is it full-on rhetorical?
Open support and much more sort of openly supportive than China. They're an arms client of Russia, and Russia was really the first major country to sort of openly recognize the junta as the legitimate government. China has been a little bit more cautious. I mean, I think this is on China's border, so the ramifications of anything that happens in Myanmar directly affect China in terms of refugee flows and conflict on its borders, whereas Russia is, far, far away, and nothing that happens in Myanmar is really going to have any effect on Russia itself. But China has slowly moved in the direction of essentially accepting the junta and they have essentially accepted the junta as the legitimate government of Myanmar, which most other countries have not done, and have kind of encouraged Southeast Asian states to accept them as well.
And when dealing with the junta government, military government, would you think we should see them as rational and predictable or as rogue actors? You could say the United States, you could say United Nations, you could say international bodies.
I don't think you should ever look at someone as an irrational actor unless they've proven that they're complete insanity. I mean, I'm sure there are people like that we could imagine in history. I think that the military is acting in ways that are consistent with its history, which is that it still prizes the power and control of the country above all else. And this is probably not the scenario that was originally imagined when they planned the February 1st coup, but like I said, the scenario that was imagined was that they were going to have some low degree of protest, and they were going to co-opt some political groups that were going to create a sort of pseudo process towards an election that the military party would win, and the world would accept that, and they'd be sort of like the Thai military, which is sort of fiddled around the electoral system there to allow essentially a military party to be in control without actually having the military directly in control. And that did not work in Myanmar, and they have made the choice, I don't think irrationally from their part, but based on their sort of view of that they would rather have control of a burning country than negotiate.
That's right. And when I say rogue or predictable, I mean more as in, do you think their stated goals of saying, okay, we are merely taking power to have a democratic election, and then whoever wins, do you think that's genuine or no?
I'm not even sure that was their stated goal, but I'd have to look back. I mean, they were saying that there was fraud in the election. That's how Suu Kyi's party won. That the election run up to the election that Suu Kyi won had some irregularities, but they were minor, and it was a fairly free and fair election, and Suu Kyi's party won enormously. So, no, I think that's ludicrous. Obviously, if the military wanted to have a democratic system in Myanmar, they would have let the party that won the free and fair election take power, and they would cede civilian control of the military. So no, but that doesn't make them irrational. But the fact that their stated goals are ludicrous doesn't make them irrational. It just means that they're lying about their stated goal.
What action can we take? If anything, is it legally binding at all or no?
Is what legally binding?
Any resolutions that we push forward, or should we just focus on rhetoric and try to? Oh, just U.S. and Canada, just the West in general, you could say.
I mean, I'm not sure you mean by legally binding.
Well, if say we introduced a motion in Security Council, that could be legally binding. But if we just went through General Assembly, or if we just pushed for rhetorical support of certain groups, that's not legally binding. But if we were to push for, well, some administrations might do regime change, either forced or rhetorical.
Sure legally binding. First of all, nothing is going to be passed through the Security Council. Russia sits on the Security Council, as does China. But even if I guess by legally binding, you mean by something by the Security Council. I'm not sure if that means legally binding, but that's unlikely to happen. I mean, I think the best things the U.S. can do and other actors can do right now is to encourage countries in the region who are going to increasingly overrun with Myanmar refugees, to take them in and not send them back into Myanmar into an extremely dangerous situation, to be willing to accept Myanmar refugees themselves after them being processed through countries like Thailand or Malaysia, and to figure out ways to deliver aid into Myanmar in ways that to try to avert complete state collapse and humanitarian disaster in ways that don't get the money to the military, as well as taking method actions to try to cut off as much as possible, and these are limited, flows of money to the military.
If there was one or a few takeaways from this whole situation, what do you want them to be? What do you want people to take away from this?
Ultimately, the takeaway is that even more than any other military in the world, the Myanmar military has remained almost alone in the world, committed to this ideology of sort of militaristic xenophobia. I guess you could say North Korea, but North Korea is a little bit, or Eritrea. There are other highly authoritarian regimes where the military plays a role, but they tend to be sort of personalist dictatorships. And Myanmar has instead been this sort of incredibly powerful xenophobic military dictatorship with a whole range of leaders. There was some personalization of some of them, like Ne Win, the original dictator, but the Min Aung Hlaing and the prior dictator, Than Shwe, there wasn't the level of personalistic dictatorship that you see like in like North Korea, for example. It's really a sort of unique case of this, the military essentially just parasitically gutting the country for its own self for decades. It's a tragedy. External actors should be encouraged to find ways to try to prevent a complete humanitarian collapse, as well as to put pressure on countries in the region not to push Myanmar refugees back into Myanmar, which is both against international, norms and conventions and completely inhumane as well.
I agree. Once again, many thanks to Josh Kurlantzick for agreeing to participate and for his wonderful contributions. Finally, I spoke with Sebastian Strangio, who is the Southeast Asia editor at the Diplomat. We spoke about great and regional power dynamics in Myanmar, putting particular emphasis on China. We also spoke about what policy prescriptions would look like for the US and for regional powers in Southeast Asia. And what would you say is the extent of international powers, great powers within, or even regional powers within that situation? Would you say there's a lot of stakes with China, Russia, US, or even other powers like Indonesia, Pakistan, India, or more regional powers? Do they have something at stake here?
Well, the Chinese certainly do. I mean, Myanmar shares a very long border with China, which runs through some remote and strategically sensitive parts of Southwest China. And so, China has been, obviously watching developments in Myanmar very closely. I can talk a little bit more about exactly what China wants in Myanmar later on. Suffice to say that it's concerned above all with stability in Myanmar. It had established fairly good relations with the old NLD government and had, moved forward with, a series of strategic infrastructure investments that are designed to connect Yunnan province in China's southwest with the Indian Ocean and Myanmar's coast. And, I think that the Chinese were caught, like many people, by surprise for this coup. I don't think they knew that it was going to happen, despite rumor to the contrary. And, they have, they've been watching very closely the developments ever since then. Obviously, Myanmar is, a strategically important country. It sits at the crossroad of two of Asia's two largest powers, shares borders with both of them. A decade ago, when the country began to reopen, began to loosen its political controls, and that led to a sort of revival of relations with Western democracies that had embargoed Myanmar and imposed a wall of sanctions against it during the last couple of decades of military rule. And that led to sort of an increased sort of strategic competition in Myanmar. You had the Japanese who were already present, but them deepening their involvement in the country. You had the United States and the European Union and various European countries becoming more involved in Myanmar's development, reopening formal diplomatic engagements with it, opening embassies and so forth. And, this challenged, what had previously been, a very dominant Chinese presence in the country, given that, so many other countries had cut off ties with it. The situation now is, it has complex implications for the strategic competition between China and the United States. And on the one hand, the US is very far away from Myanmar, it doesn't really have any direct national interests there. And so it sort of can afford to sort of take a fairly strong line against the Myanmar junta. It has imposed sanctions on a whole host of leading members of the junta, military-owned conglomerates. The EU and other Western countries have done the same. But the Chinese, are very pragmatic, and they've got a lot more direct economic and strategic interest in the country. And so they've, as I've seen in the last few days, they have actually moved, I think, to sort of formally recognize the junta and begin working with it to continue advancing those interests forward. But sort of there is a sort of risk that with a strong opposition movement now emerging in Myanmar and China throwing its weight, at least diplomatically, behind the military government and agreeing to work with it, that the crisis in Myanmar might begin to fall along lines of international strategic competition, that if the Western countries begin to decide that it's in their interests to provide concrete backing to anti-junta forces and the national unity government that's been formed by opponents of the military, we could see Myanmar become a proxy conflict of China-US rivalry. So far, things haven't really been moving in that direction. I think that I think there's the fact that most Southeast Asian countries are maintaining open relation. They're maintaining their contacts with the junta. They're not taking they're not taking the more punitive steps that a lot of Western countries are. And the Indians and the Japanese, about Chinese inroads in Myanmar, are maintaining their contacts, with the military government and refusing to sort of go down that very punitive path. In some ways, the further a country is away from Myanmar, the more it can afford to take a hard line. But for those countries bordering it, even if they don't like the new military government, they have to work with it, in recognition of the fact that it controls the state and its coercive power. And so that's sort of the situation now. But there's definitely a risk that Myanmar becomes embroiled or becomes a subject of superpower competition, if not now, then certainly, in future years.
That's right. And with China having more localized interests in the region as opposed to the US and other Western countries, what has been the extent of the involvement of the Chinese? Is it direct, or they propose mediation? So you mentioned investment there. How far does it go? And how willing are the Chinese to intervene in this matter? Or are they kind of hands-off approach, as they've done in other regions like the Middle East, where they do have interests, they do have values, they do have things they would like to see happen, but they don't necessarily want to influence it directly? Is that the case for Myanmar, or is it a lot more complicated than that?
Well, that's certainly the case rhetorically. The Chinese government, claims that it is adhering to a doctrine of non-interference in the internal affairs of other states, and so it's sort of applied that rubric to the situation in Myanmar until the last week, when we've seen some moves toward business as usual, I suppose, with the junta. The Chinese were fairly. They were non-critical, but I think privately they were very frustrated with what had happened in Myanmar. Something that threatens very the coup has really threatened Myanmar's stability, its economic prosperity, and really opened the door to a decade crisis and stagnation. And from the Chinese perspective, that's simply irrational that they would choose to do that. The problem that Myanmar is facing is that for a lot of the people in the streets protesting this coup, China's inaction, its fence sitting, its unwillingness to actively oppose the junta is being seen as a form of interference in itself. And this is showing up some of the contradictions in this idea of non-interference, that the Chinese, by not interfering, they are interfering on the wrong side. And this has been a common refrain of a lot of the anti-coup forces. But China has a lot of, I mean, the country conducts a lot of trade with Myanmar. Much of it runs overland on newly resurfaced and expanded highways that run from Yunnan province into Shan State and Kachin State, and from there onwards into the heartland of Myanmar. China has also, for several decades, has seen Myanmar as a potential western coast. China doesn't have a Californian coast. It doesn't have that outlet to the sea, and it has for many years has sort of advanced infrastructure projects that would open up a corridor that running from China to the Indian Ocean. Recently, it built oil and gas pipelines that run across Myanmar, pumping oil and gas into China's interior. It has plans for highways and a rail line running along the same route, and a host of special economic zones which will increase trade along the borders. Really what China wants is to integrate Myanmar more fully into the Chinese economy, create a market for its exports, but also to create an alternative route for imports of oil from the Middle East. Because of course, so much of China's, a large proportion of China's oil imports run through the Strait of Malacca, this choke point that could easily be, cut off by outside power. And this is something that Chinese have feared since the early 2000s. As China's economies become more dependent on exports to the world market and imports of oil from the Middle East and the Persian Gulf, it's become more concerned about the security, its energy security, and the long-term, viability of that. So Myanmar has a very important role to play in that broader strategic goal. And so, really, it's unsurprising to see Myanmar, the Chinese moving towards sort of a more, business as usual approach in Myanmar. I think that they, seeing no immediate solution in sight, and probably, seeing that for all the sanctions that Western governments have imposed, their concrete actions that they've taken to support the opposition forces have been relatively slight so far. They probably feel that, betting on the junta is a fairly sure thing. And, they have core interests that they're seeking to, resume, and I think that they, that they've sort of lost patience, and they feel that, that they sooner or later they need to re-engage and in pursuit of these broader strategic goals. China's got a lot to do in Myanmar, so I think that explains its very pragmatic decision to re-engage, even though this is something that's likely to make an enemy of China among a large proportion of the Myanmar public.
That's right. And I'll circle back to energy and other strategic interests later on. But for now, I wanted to talk about, so you mentioned tacit consent of China and re-engagement, and how basically its inaction is tacit consent as a rejection of Myanmar's projected liberalization, democratization, or would you say goes to other things, more economic or security related concerns that the Chinese have?
I don't think the Chinese have any, clear ideological aim here. I mean, actually, while the Chinese were sort of caught off guard by the extent of the political reforms that took place a decade ago, they were able to change tack and work with the elected civilian government quite effectively. They invested very early on in Aung San Suu Kyi's government. They courted her personally, even before she was elected. They were the first. The foreign minister of China was the first foreign minister to visit Myanmar after Suu Kyi took office. So there is, China has been quite able to work with the civilian government. And the fact that it was democratic, or more democratic than what had come before, was no bar to China's engagement with it. I don't think the Chinese particularly care whether Myanmar is a liberal democracy, a illiberal democracy, or an authoritarian state. Its view on this question, again, exactly who Myanmar is really the more important question here. And it seems that, that's something that's highly contested within the country right now, obviously. So that's sort of where the tension comes in there. And the fact that the Chinese have thrown their support behind the generals, or sort of sent the message that the generals are now the government of Myanmar, is likely to be received with a great deal of hostility among anti-coup opposition forces. But China's interest in Myanmar is simply too important from Beijing's perspective to jettison in the pursuit of a democratized Myanmar. I think the Chinese are very realistic about the limits of their power in the country, even though they do have a lot of leverage. I think that the Chinese, this applies across the board. I think when it comes to democratic development, Chinese policymakers are in many ways, much more realistic about these things than a lot of Western policymakers are. However, there is the tendency, for this pragmatism to veer into sort of, a collaborationist sort of approach, which tars China with association with hated governments. And so its willingness to work with the old military junta before 2011, made it a subject of considerable, hostility in Myanmar. And we're seeing that even more now in the aftermath of the coup.
And is that breaking with this kind of superpower paradigm where the United States and Great Britain before that were promoting their values throughout the world? Because you mentioned China being more pragmatic, it's definitely more realist in its approach. Is that breaking with that sort of paradigm, that old notion that superpowers have interests and principles, and they are pragmatic, but they also want to promote their principles and values, not necessarily always their interests?
Well, China's, is certainly seeking to promote a certain vision of international order that serves its own interests, in particular, the preservation of the CCP's power. So what we've seen was China pushing back against Western attempts to evangelize democratic systems and to promote democracy, either through funding civil society, the National Endowment for Democracy, or through, forceful means, regime change operations, as we've seen in the Middle East. I think China's vision of international order is one in which, sovereign borders between nations are reinforced, and the principle of sovereignty is placed at the very center. This explains, I think, China's hostility to norms of human rights, which are override norms of sovereignty, especially the responsibility to protect, which really that principle explicitly lays out limits to sovereignty. And I think the Chinese government, with the support of a lot of nations in the global South, is seeking to recenter the norm of national sovereignty. I think that beyond these sovereign borders, China is mostly concerned with whether governments are aligned with its own interests. So in Southeast Asia, is much more concerned with securing nations' support for its, for economic intercourse and for support for China's strategic goals, rather than any particular concern with how, these nations handle their political affairs internally. I also think that the Chinese, in many ways, if you look when China's economic growth, its real takeoff, it happens at the end of the Cold War, after the Tiananmen massacre, after the Southern tour in 1992 of Deng Xiaoping. You see China's economy, that's when it really approaches takeoff. And this is an era in which, the United States and a lot of other Western powers, including, scholars and pundits in these countries, claiming liberal democracy to be the future of humanity. And I think that this poses a lot of implicit and explicit challenges to the Communist Party's rule in China. And so the CCP, China, has grown into a world in which liberal norms are sort of the operating principles of this global order. And I think what China is doing now is, I think, seeking to shift those operating norms into something that's more based on the norm of sovereignty, and also to sort of push against Western claims that sort of liberal democracy is the best system. So I think there is a real sense within China that we're going to show the West that China's system is the most efficient and effective in certain ways. And we've seen that obviously with its response to COVID-19 and its vaccine diplomacy. That sort of stops short of telling countries to adopt a certain model of development and conditioning Chinese support on that. We don't really see a Chinese version of democracy promotion.
And is China trying to change social norms on the international level through its involvement in Myanmar, or is it mostly pragmatic interests?
Well, I do think if we've seen, China's actions in, the Security Council and the Human Rights Council, there is, an attempt to sort of reshape these norms. Granted, the Security Council has always been about war and peace, and the vetoes have been there since the beginning and have been used by all powers for in support of their national interests. So China's actions in blocking sort of strong statements on Myanmar or more concerted action on Myanmar aren't really surprising. Chinese feel that they were burned by abstaining from the Libya intervention in 2011. I think that, that the fact that proceeded to a regime change operation, has left a strong impression on the leadership in China, and made their cooperation on, on a similar sort of resolution unlikely. But yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert on this particular question, but it's clear that China is seeking to emphasize certain norms and de-emphasize others in organs of of global governance. And I mean, many of the ones that are putting are in the UN Charter. The sovereignty of states is sort of a bedrock of the UN system. It's seeking to sort of highlight those things that serve its interests the most, and to sort of delegitimize and hamstring those that it sees as a threat to its interests. And universal norms of human rights, the Chinese view as having been weaponized by Western powers to sort of contain China and keep it down.
Does great power competition in Myanmar and Southeast Asia, even more broadly, does it go beyond the US and US adjacent powers in China? Is the ASEAN involved at all, or is it purely symbolic? Is Russia involved, or other regional actors involved?
Southeast Asia is much more complex than a simply US-China dyad. I mean, there are a lot of other incumbent powers in the region that make it a naturally multipolar region, and do give Southeast Asian countries more room for maneuver than they would have in a purely bipolar system. So you have the Japanese. Japan is the third largest economy in the world, has been economically engaged in Southeast Asia, very strongly since the 1970s. Many of Japan's corporations have factories in places like Thailand and Indonesia, and have done for a very long time. This was really one of the things that fueled the remarkable economic success of 5 Southeast Asian tiger economies in the 80s and 90s. A point in which China's investment and trade with the region was relatively small. And so the Japanese, they've been very active in sort of, maritime security cooperation, economic cooperation, trade, offering Southeast Asian nations an alternative to Chinese-funded infrastructure. Japan's very active in building bridges and highways, metro systems, and what have you across the region. So you have Japan. You also have countries like South Korea that are present in the region. India punches below its weight in Southeast Asia still, but one can assume that as time goes by, this will become more relevant in the region. You have countries like Australia. When it comes to Myanmar, we have seen Russia become involved. I mean, they sent their deputy foreign minister to the Armed Forces Parade on March 27th, a day in which the Myanmar military massacred upwards of 100 protesters in various parts of the country. Russia, along with China, is one of the main suppliers of arms to Myanmar's military. And I think the Russians are using the turmoil in Myanmar now very cynically to, and I think in a much more purposeful way than the Chinese, to sort of undermine, the liberal international. And I think that the Russians really do seem to have more of an ideological thrust to what they're doing in Myanmar. But yeah, I mean, the region there are many poles of power, some of them more, exerting a stronger magnetic pull than others. But it's certainly far from being a simple bipolarity. If the US and China were to move to, open conflict, I think that would change. And you would see countries having choices forced upon them, as to how they would align. But for the moment, the Southeast Asian countries are, you mentioned ASEAN. So ASEAN's, has its principle, or it's one of its sort of fundamental aims is to sort of maintain, a balance between outside contending powers, and to set itself up as an arena in which these powers, the clash between competing outside powers, can be moderated, in which these powers can sit down at the same table and talk with each other. This is what is known as ASEAN centrality. This, sort of generally agreed upon idea that ASEAN can host major summits and become kind of an arena for great powers to talk out their differences. So ASEAN has studiously avoided choosing sides, and it has made it very clear, as have individual Southeast Asian countries particularly, that in fact it's more the individual countries that have articulated this, in clearer terms, but that the region does not want to have to choose. It has good economic relationships with China, benefits from security, the security presence of the United States, and the Singaporean Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong said in 2019 at the Shangri-La summit that the US and China should sort out their differences, and that really he had strong words for both of these superpowers, telling them they should put aside their sort of mutual competition and rivalry in the interests of peace and harmony and all and prosperity. It doesn't appear that they're listening to him, though, and I think that as this sort of competition between these two powers becomes more intense, Southeast Asia and ASEAN are going to be placed under additional strain. And the balancing act, the sort of having and eating of cake by the Southeast Asian countries, is going to become more and more complicated. So, there's turbulent times ahead for this region.
Thank you to everyone listening in. Feel free to give us a like or subscribe to the channel if you like our content. or listen in on SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, or any other podcasting app. Feel free to follow us on Twitter and Instagram as well. I'll include the links in the description box. And feel free to debate the ideas put forward in these episodes by submitting a comment, counter video, or by emailing us at realpolitikpodcast1@gmail.com. And if you'd like to support us, please check out our Patreon. Thank you very much for listening and take good care. Goodbye and until next time.